Conference Series. My name is Jose Ortiz Jr., and I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. It's great to be here with you. Today is the second installment in our four-part series of our virtual conference. We will discuss the role of policy and advocacy. This afternoon, I have the pleasure of sitting down with three experts with diverse perspectives. They are Mary Clagett, Senior Director of Workforce and Educational Policy Team at Jobs for the Future, Rebecca Karp, Managing Principal and CEO of Carp Industries, and Katie Spiker, Director of Government Affairs at National Skills Coalition. Thank you to the members and partners and friends that have joined us this afternoon. A special thank you to JPMorgan Chase, Verizon, Google, and all of our sponsors for supporting the NYCETC Conference Series. NYCETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYCETC's membership is composed of nearly 180 workforce development providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers. Before we get started, all participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this call. I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and discuss the role of policy and advocacy that is played over the course of this inclusive recovery effort and should continue in workforce during this challenging time for our city, state, and nation. We'll then open it up for a few questions from several members and partners. Throughout the conversation, please type your questions along with your name, title, and organization using the chat icon located on the bottom panel. We will unmute and tee up some guests who have questions so that she or he may ask questions directly to our speaker. We'll try our best to get to as many of them as time will allow. I will now introduce our speakers. Mary is the Senior Director of Workforce Policy for the Workforce and Education Policy Group at Jobs for the Future. Mary has more than 25 years of experience working with the U.S. Congress in fields of education, workforce development, and human services policy. Before joining JFF, Mary served in a similar capacity for the National Center of Education and the Economy, and previously served as the lead staff for Republicans on the U.S. House Committee on Education and Workforce, responsible for workforce development and career preparation legislation, including the Workforce Investment Act of 1998, the National School to Work Opportunities Act, and numerous other measures related to workforce, education, and human services. She has also served in the U.S. Senate on the Labor and Human Resources Committee for the West Virginia Senator Jennings Randolph. Mary earned her undergraduate degree from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, and carried out her graduate work at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Rebecca Karp is Managing Principal and CEO of Carp Strategies. Utilizing a data-driven, qualitative, and place-based approach to planning, Rebecca has grown her company into one of the leading women-owned urban planning businesses in New York. With extensive experience in planning, analysis, and stakeholder development, Rebecca is a trusted advisor to real estate developers, energy companies, community organizations, and government agencies across the nation. She's a board member for the Center of Urban Pedagogy and adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Preservation, Architecture, and Planning. Rebecca is an alumna of NYU Stern, MIT, Bowdoin College, and Choral Leadership New York. Rebecca began her career as a policy advisor on workforce and economic development, resiliency, and transportation at city and regional agencies. A Hudson Valley native, Rebecca lives in Brooklyn with her husband, Jason, and dog Quincy. Katie Spiker is Director of Government Affairs with the National Skills Coalition. Prior to joining NSC, Ms. Spiker was the Associate Director for the National Center for Women's Employment Equity at Wider Opportunities for Women, and has consulted with the Institute for Women's Policy Research and National Women's Law Center. She served as a policy counsel for workplace flexibility in 2010, and the National Partnership for Women and Families as a Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow. Katie is a 2015 Ford Foundation Public Voices Fellow and holds a JD from George Washington University Law Center. Mary, Rebecca, and Katie, thank you again for joining us and welcome. So let's get started. I just shared a bit about each of your backgrounds. Let's just please take a minute or two to tell us a bit more about your work and the role you play in today's topic. Why don't we start with Katie?
Thanks, Jose. Excited to be part of the conversation today. National Skills Coalition is a national organization fighting for inclusive, high quality skills training so that people have better access to have access to a better life. Local businesses can see sustained growth. We engage in analysis and technical assistance, organizing, advocacy, and communications, all focused on improving state and federal policies. We mobilize our national, state, business, worker networks to advance this call to action through specific policy agendas in states and in DC. Last fall, we released a call to action called our Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery policy document that offered 8 policy goals that can help ensure that workers and small businesses most impacted by the pandemic can drive and thrive in our nation's economy. We focused on 3 big themes throughout that agenda. The first is the disproportionate impact that the economic crisis has had on workers of color, immigrants, and on workers with a high school diploma or less. The second is the essential role of small businesses. And then the third is the moral and economic imperative to dismantle structural racism in workforce education and training. And look forward to getting into more of those pieces later on in the conversation.
Thanks, Katie. Rebecca?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. So as Jose said, my name is Rebecca Karp. I'm the CEO and Managing Principal of Carp Strategies. We're a community economic development and urban planning consultancy based in New York City, but we have the privilege of working nationwide with public and private sector organizations to truly advance inclusive development across a range of urban and rural priorities, including affordable housing and real estate, transportation and infrastructure, workforce, community development, and renewable energy. Every single day, my team shows up, whether it be in our living rooms now or formerly at our office, with the mission of, helping our clients and our partners, full stop, thinking about how do we build stronger communities and economies, consider what deep prosperity looks like so that people can thrive in the places where they are. And first and foremost, I think for us, that means, what does a good job look like? How do you access a good job? What does it mean to keep that job? And what are the interconnected systems that underpin that work? So for my team, it means, does that mean working on economic development strategy for a city? Does that mean explicitly working on transportation plans so that people can get to that good job? Does it mean developing an explicit workforce development strategy? It can show up a little bit different for every project that we take on, but we have a kind of a whole systems approach, to the work, and tend to think about it either working with cities, nonprofit organizations, or sometimes even private developers. So really looking forward to bringing a bit of that perspective to the conversation today.
Thanks, Rebecca. Finally, Mary?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mary Clagett. I work at Jobs for the Future, and JFF has worked at the intersection of workforce development, economic development, and education for over 35 years now. A lot of our focus, in fact, primary focus is on low income or other individuals who experience barriers to education and employment. And this year, similar to what others have talked about, we've put out recommendations for achieving an equitable economic recovery, particularly in response to COVID, but also in response to years of historical racism and inequities. Our focus is really building around helping all people rebound and advance in this economy, revitalizing regional economies to help achieve those goals. And then we are focusing a lot on redesigning education and workforce development systems to make sure that we help people in the most efficient ways to get back to work. And so I look forward to talking with you all today. We have a lot to tell you, I think, about what's happening in Washington, and I look forward to your input as well.
Thanks, Mary. So you really segued really nicely into the next question. So this is really for Katie and Mary, given both of your respective organizations and the role that you both play within your organizations. Can you bring a unique national perspective into today's discussion? So for both of you, and maybe we start with Katie, around policy and funding discussion, and both of you can plug into wherever you feel most comfortable. What are you seeing at the national level around the role workforce development is playing or should be playing in aiding in the pandemic recovery effort?
I guess the unfortunate answer to that is there are two different answers to those questions, the role that it is playing and the role that it should be playing. I'll let Mary talk a little bit more about the lack of investment that we've seen out of stimulus deals and the fact that Congress really is failing to recognize the role that the folks that are listening today have to play in ensuring that workers and businesses are prepared to recover from the current pandemic. At National Skills Coalition, we've been focusing on 4 big themes of the role of the workforce system and partners in ensuring an inclusive economic recovery. So the first is adequate investment levels in training for workers who have lost their jobs and upskilling for workers who are most vulnerable to that job loss. We've got 10 million workers that are unemployed right now. The jobs numbers just came out. 40% of those workers have been long-term unemployed for more than 27 weeks. These are workers who need training and reskilling in order to get the jobs that are both coming back now in response to the current crisis and that will be back when our economy recovers. And of course, Mary will talk a little bit more about this, but and the folks on the call know this better than the people that we're advocating to. The workforce system was already in a deficit with funding before we entered the current crisis. So the fact that we have millions of new workers who need reskilling and supports in order to succeed in that training is just going to further delay our path to an inclusive economic recovery. The second piece that we've been focusing on is ensuring that job creation, such as through an infrastructure package or some of the conversations around a health workforce, include connections to training, in-demand credentials, and long-term careers. We want to be sure that if we pass $1 trillion infrastructure package, there's some numbers from the Georgetown Center on Employment and Workforce that says that that would lead to 11 million new jobs. And these are the workers who we need to have access to these jobs, both need to be in communities in which the projects are being built and need to have training today in order to access and succeed in those jobs. The third big piece we've been focusing on is supporting the infrastructure of industry engagement in our economic recovery and ensuring that community and technical colleges have the capacity to work with industry so that when there is the opportunity to reskill and upskill workers who have lost their jobs, we're able to do so effectively, efficiently, and meeting industry demand. And then the fourth big piece is ensuring workers today to fill the jobs of tomorrow. And we'll get into later in the conversation some of the pieces around digital literacy, but just focusing really closely on the fact that even before the pandemic, it was apparent that American jobs are undergoing massive technological transformation, and the current crisis has only exacerbated the need both for people to be able to learn and work remotely, but also the kind of technical skills and occupational digital literacy that they need to be able to succeed and progress once people are in jobs.
Thanks, Katie. Mary?
Yeah, and I just want to build on what Katie was just talking about, because we work really closely on a lot of these issues and in complete agreement with what she was just talking about. Funding for workforce, and you all know this, you who have been working in this field for a long time, funding for workforce development in this country is abysmally inadequate. The OECD looked at other European and comparable countries, other OECD countries and developed nations, particularly in Europe. And if we were spending at a comparable percent of GDP to what other countries are spending, we would be putting over $80 billion into workforce development in this country. Right now in total, and this isn't just WIOA, this is in total, if you count everything except for Pell Grants, we only spend somewhere between 14 and 16 billion. We only spend $3.5 billion on the formula programs that go for funding for adult dislocated workers and youth in this country, so the WIOA formula grants. It's shameful. And you all know, I mean, the workforce system is always the first to take hits about it being inadequate, being not doing what it's supposed to do. I mean, we have, and I'm guilty of this because I was one of the policy people that have worked on legislation in the past. We have put all kinds of requirements in and expectations for the workforce system into law. And that's as it should be. It's what our workforce system needs to do. But we haven't followed up with funding. In the COVID relief packages, funding has been discussed about workforce. I think they put in maybe $345 million for national emergency grants in the CARES Act. But even Democrats like Chairman Scott in the House and Patty Murray in the Senate, who have pushed relaunching America's Workforce Act that would provide $15 billion. They have, even though they're chairs of their committees, they haven't been successful to get that funding in. It hasn't been seen as a priority, and we have to change that. And $15 billion, frankly, is a drop in the bucket. I mean, we need so much more. So, and we can talk more about this as we go on, but it's just something we have to change.
Thank you. So Rebecca, given your experience in the work in your lead up to your organization now that you're working with at Carp Strategies, and at Carp Strategies, you play a uniquely different role and have a different perspective in this discussion. What are you seeing on the ground? And if you can, speak to the areas that have been further exacerbated as a result of the pandemic.
Sure, I really appreciate the question. And it's really interesting, Mary and Katie, we were talking about what you're seeing at the national level and the things that each of your organizations in your work are really advocating for, because what I'm seeing on the ground in the work that I have the privilege of doing in and around Boston and greater metro New York and Atlanta, and in rural communities, smaller communities as well, like suburban New Jersey and whatnot. I mean, there's been a wholesale shift since the start of COVID and the recession to many organizations on the ground shifting to emergency response, right? Some workforce development organizations, and that's been by necessity. We're seeing record unemployment, and in some sectors that haven't experienced this kind of unemployment since the last recession. So record high numbers and sustained unemployment that has necessitated, emergency response that we just haven't seen before. And we're seeing this, sustained levels. That's stunning. When I walk around my neighborhood, I see the lines, out the door at churches, that have food pantries. That's been sustained now for going on 10 months. Right. And this is in many neighborhoods, not just in New York, but around the country. So we're seeing on the ground, workforce development organizations being pushed in ways that they have never been pushed before with, systemic underfunding, as Mary and Katie are saying, from the national level gets passed down to states and then gets passed down to cities and smaller municipalities with increased competition, I think, especially for nonprofit organizations who are then going to philanthropy and elsewhere for support, right? So competition when we wish there could be collaboration and cooperation that we don't always see. So that's one, right? Everyone is still in emergency response mode in a sustained way that's exhausting. I think number two, we're seeing an opportunity that I think we haven't seen before for a more open discussion about some of the systemic challenges that America faces around systemic racism and injustice, and a more open conversation, not just at the national level, but at the very local level around real challenges in the workforce development system. And so we see policy and advocacy organizations locally really talking about, I need funding for these programs because of systemic and historical racism and challenges in the system that are baked into our policies. And because the policy is designed in this way and shows up in a racist way, I have these hurdles I need to meet. And therefore it shows up in inequitable action. And therefore I need to make these changes. And as horrible as it is to realize this and talk about it, it's also exciting and promising to be able to talk about it and name these issues really openly and have painful and hard conversations, because I think by having the hard conversations, we can work toward changing policies, changing how funding streams, are designed, and move toward more equitable action. So I'm also seeing on the ground, a real shift in the conversation and hopefully moving from the momentum from protests, like really moving toward different types of action, on the ground toward more inclusive development with respect to workforce, which is exciting. It's really exciting.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get a little bit into some of the questions, because I definitely have a question, is the impact of the social unrest and the movement on workforce strategies moving forward. But staying with you for a second, you mentioned this earlier in your description of the work that you do at Carp Strategies and talking about the kind of interconnected nature of the system. And we talk about that in workforce all the time. But in truth, so much of the system, while dependent on each other, is also quite disconnected and fractured. So Can you speak to that and its impact on policy at all levels of, or any level of government that you're experiencing?
Sure, absolutely. And I think Katie and Mary probably have thoughts on this too. I mean, Katie started to refer to this a little bit in some of the priorities that her organization has, but I think I have the privilege, working a little bit on the urban planning side, where, for example, I'll have a client that's a major real estate developer. And it's very easy to think about like a large scale mixed use development project that'll have, offices and like life science lab space and residential housing, and you could think, oh, that's just a real estate development project. But when I think about it, I'm like, okay, this is actually a workforce development project, because there are going to be a lot of jobs that are going to be created, not just on the construction side, but in all of those uses in the labs and everything that's going to be coming. So in my mind, as soon as we know that project is being initiated, this isn't just a city planning project. It's not just a real estate project. It's a workforce project. And so then who are we talking to in terms of community colleges and CTE and the local high schools, the local WIB? All of this needs to be in the room from the very beginning. And so I think, there are cases that we can look at where we see silos, where there's, different disciplines are really split up. And I think to Mary's point about lack of funding, I think there's a more creative way we can be thinking about some of these really large scale, for example, development projects, where workforce nonprofits or agencies can be in the room from the very beginning and capture part of those funding streams from other agencies, because we want to make sure, local residents are being prepared and trained and have access to those jobs that are being created, from the jump, as soon as we know that those projects are going to be coming. So I think there's some of that interconnectedness. I also think, like, when we're talking about transportation projects, when we're talking about housing projects, those are also workforce development projects. Because if you don't have stable housing, it'll be very hard to hold down a good job. If you're taking 3 buses to get someplace versus, a 15-minute bus ride or a 15-minute drive or a 20-minute walk, it's harder to keep and get to a good job. So in my mind, kind of it all goes together. And I would love to see a way that, workforce development, we aren't always kind of, begging to be part of the conversation, but rather the expectation is that workforce development professionals are always in the room. They're always in the room. As much as you're asking someone from, Office of Management and Budget to be in the room, you're also like, oh, we can't start because no one from workforce development is here. Like, I want that to be the norm. That's my dream.
I think that's a shared dream by everybody on this call.
Yeah, and can I add just a bit to that? I couldn't agree more. And in addition to economic development and community development, we're looking at ways to increase, and we have been talking about this for years, but really looking at ways to increase this connection to higher education, adult education, poverty alleviation strategies. We really need to focus on skills development and helping people gain the tools that they need to become self-sufficient. Katie talked a lot about infrastructure, but anything that we do on green jobs, anything that we do on, she mentioned health workforce, and again, economic development should have workforce people at the table, should have strong workforce funding components, because people, particularly if we're going to provide access to people who've traditionally been marginalized, we have to provide them with the skills they need for these good new jobs. And I know, Katie, I think you were trying to get in on it too.
I'm happy to add something here, or if we want to transition.
Sure.
Oh, okay, sorry, I saw your mute thing.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, I think that's certainly what we all aspire to, is that the conversation is not strictly about training for the sake of training, but obviously it's aligned to all aspects of the system. And there's a lot more work to be done there, but appreciate your perspectives. And I think one of the things that also came up in some of the remarks that have already been made is how, over the course of the last year, we were all made witnesses to how prevalent the digital divide or digital poverty is in this country, and its impact on people who would, currently and historically benefit from the workforce development system. So I think obviously there are a number of different supportive areas that are required for folks to have in order to be successful participants in workforce. But sticking to this particular issue for a second, because obviously as I've said before, and folks in our community are well aware of, you can't work from home, you can't learn from home, you can't seek employment benefits and services from home if you're not connected. And so how should we be advocating for good digital policy and tech policy at the national, state, and local levels in order to ensure accessibility and promotion of internet computer access and tech fluency? And I will, Katie or Rebecca, do you want to start?
I'm happy to. You know, you really laid out the three pieces is the way that National Skills Coalition and folks on this call may be familiar with my colleague Amanda Berkson-Shilcock's really incredible analysis and work on this issue. Where you look at the idea of, do people have access to broadband, do they have access to devices, and then do they have the skills to use and access both of those tools? And there's a lot of conversation happening at the federal level around access. And I think one of the really important pieces of your question was, how do we advocate for good policy? And I think one of the key pieces of that is advocating for digital literacy, digital skills, and occupational digital literacy to be embedded in what we need for a foundation for closing that digital divide from the beginning. We have to embed that someone has access to those skills from the point that we're expanding access to devices and to broadband. And just to give some flavor around that. So obviously digital skill gaps exist in every industry and in every demographic of workers. Workers of color are disproportionately affected because of structural factors that are the product of longstanding inequities in American society. For example, Black workers comprise 12% of all workers, but represent 15% with no or limited digital skills. Latinx workers are 14% of all workers, but 35% of workers with no digital skills, and 20% of those with limited. And when we look across industries, the same kind of challenges persist. And again, because of the challenges that we've seen because of the current crisis, it's becoming even more of a challenge, both from the industry side and from worker access. Half of construction, transportation, and storage sector workers have limited or no digital skills, but we've seen rapid increases for demands from those jobs in recent years, from construction workers using drones to collect survey data, to bus drivers who are required to complete online safety training modules. In the health and social work sector, 33% of those workers have limited or no digital skills. And the pandemic has shown that these skills are obviously of critical importance for providing telehealth services, recording patient data. And I think that these are all really important things for us to paint the scope of the problem. But the bigger challenge goes back to when we're talking about the advocacy piece of the question, which is many of the folks on this call have probably been involved with some of our organizations and some of the Hill Days that we've done. And I know that your partner organization, NYCETC, has played a huge role in organizing a lot of those, the Hill visits that some of my colleagues have been putting together. And so just want to insert a huge cheerlead for everybody who has both been part of those and has the capacity to do more, because telling that story to members of Congress, both those in the leadership from your delegation when it's now Senate Majority Leader Schumer, as well as some of the committee members in both the House and Senate who are from New York and the surrounding areas of New York City, is so critical to being able to take the step between the system and workers and businesses need this investment in these policy changes to actually seeing something in a final bill. Mary and Rebecca and I can talk to Congress as much as we like, but they actually want to hear from everybody on this call. And so I can't exert enough kind of cheerleading, both gratitude for people that have done it, and then encouragement to please be in touch with you all and with NYCETC to be able to move that conversation forward even more so.
Rebecca, staying with this
Yeah.
question for a second, just in terms of public space and other things that can be done there, what should we be doing there?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts to kind of add to what Katie said, and I'm a data person. I always appreciate those stats, and I think sometimes lawmakers appreciate it too. I don't know, if I think to like my heart on this issue, which I also think is really important when we're talking about people and people's lives, if we really think about deep prosperity, and like when we talk about the mission of all of our organizations and why we're all in this work, I would argue we need to take internet and access to internet as seriously as we take people's access to clean and safe water. And if we're really talking about access to 21st century jobs and telehealth and all of these things, I think there's an argument that we position it as seriously as people's access to clean and safe water. We have an agency like in New York and other places, the Department of Environmental Protection or Public Works. It's like the steward of making sure there are pipes that get water to people. We don't have that kind of infrastructure in many places for internet and broadband. I would love to see it elevated in many cities, or towns and municipalities to that level. Because I think without that kind of attention, it feels like it's always going to be a tack on and it's always going to be optional. I feel like until people are without, they don't realize how serious it is. So I don't know, I wonder if it's a little bit of a reframing in terms of our advocacy efforts to really demonstrate how serious it is for people to being able to access things that they need. In terms of public space and infrastructure, I mean, it's a tough nut to crack, right? If you don't have broadband in your community, and if a provider is, coming in to do a public-private partnership and is asking for the sun and the moon and the stars and, big tax incentives in order to be able to lay that infrastructure, it can be really tough. But something that we've seen, it's really exciting that I'd really encourage y'all to look at is thinking about the community assets and spaces that you have that provide internet, that are kind of community hubs that you might not have thought of first. And so something that we've seen across many communities are community gathering spots like libraries, senior centers, not during the COVID pandemic, but after the pandemic, I would suggest like community rooms at hospitals, fire stations and police stations, believe it or not, sometimes have community rooms that have computers. And many of these spaces that traditionally had a single use, so no one goes to a library just to get a library book anymore. More often than not, they have a staff member who's helping people, put together a resume and access job training programs. So these are like becoming multi-purpose community facility hubs. So I think thinking about, as that library redoes their strategic plan or gets a grant from the National Landmarks Commission to redo their facade, can they get a little bit of money in there, to rehab that one room so that it becomes like a workforce training room? Like, what does that look like? I think there are ways that you can look at places within a community where people are gathering that already exist, that have internet, as a place to get started. And we've seen that be a pathway to success for many communities.
Mary, anything you want to add there?
I love that idea. And in fact, one of the things, and I think this kind of gets to that, I think the next question that you're probably going to ask us, we really do need to start changing the way we think about workforce development, where access points. We have to expand our career navigation access points and really build a much more robust system that we currently have. That'll take funding, obviously. And I think some of the things that, we were talking about before about the digital divide, it also applies to the workforce development system. We have to become much more adept at utilizing technology to provide services. There are a lot of things we could talk about, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but it's one of the things that we're really interested in looking at, how we transform the system itself and provide professional development to staff so that they can provide the most up-to-date, most effective strategies for individuals. So. Yeah,
and you reference, I think, one of the things that has come up already in the discussion is the social unrest and discussions around racial equity and the impact on workforce development. And because you do also mention we're running short on time, I just want to raise this question: what should we be doing differently in the system? And obviously, you're seeing it from many different perspectives. So, would love to hear, whoever is interested in sharing what you've seen at the national level or in other cities. Maybe we start with you, Katie.
Happy to. I mean, so there's kind of two foundational pieces that I'll say. The first that Mary and I have talked a lot about, so she may add to as well, which is there's a lot of interest both from the new administration and from Congress right now in diving into the role that policy changes and investments can have in ensuring greater access to racial equity. And so I think that to the extent that the workforce system has the capacity, both in our advocacy and in our work, to point to the role of access to workforce development and success within those programs as helping to lead towards more racial equity, that's a story that's going to be really important to be able to tell within our advocacy. The second is recognizing that there are systemic challenges within our current workforce system to being for the system itself to be racially equitable. So obviously inequities and structural barriers because of lack of access to K-12 training means that it's harder for workers of color to be able to access and succeed in post-secondary education training. Rebecca talked a little bit about the importance of being able to access reliable transportation to be able to get to jobs. If we look to the historic impact of redlining and historic structural barriers that have excluded people of color from being able to access reliable transportation, then we can really dig to the systemic level of the impacts that has on the workforce system's ability to address racial equity. That said, there are some things that we should be encouraging Congress and our partners to be able to move forward in a really effective way, thinking about how we're expanding access to services, both by more funding within the system to be able to reach more workers, recognizing the role of services that help people, like Mary talked about, get career navigation, and then really helping people access training that leads to a good job. Thinking about the quality of training services and how important that can be to someone's success. And then thinking about who are the organizations that have the capacity to partner with the public workforce system. Are we ensuring that communities and that organizations that have historically served people of color and communities of color have a voice and a role within the public workforce system?
And if I could just add really quickly to that, I think the workforce, there are a lot of strategies and things we don't know yet. I mean, clearly we don't have all the answers, but I think we do have some things that are underway that we can build on, like career pathway strategies for low skilled individuals. I'm really rethinking performance metrics and making sure that they're fair to everyone. Providing access to high demand skills in our sector strategies for everyone, particularly for people who've been traditionally or historically marginalized. And I think even things as, not that this is simple, but providing professional development for staff so that they understand kind of the subconscious racism that I think most of us carry somewhat, that so they can understand, we have to change the way we treat people and the way we look at people and the opportunities we provide to people. And then one last thing, just really quickly, the COVID response. Again, the fact that we're not focusing on skills development to me is such, everyone knows the statistics. The majority of people most adversely impacted in this, in terms of economically, are people who are low wage, lower educational levels, and tend to be marginalized populations. If we don't invest in their skills development, how are they ever going to respond equitably? So, sorry, I just had to throw that in.
The response, and I also want to just go back and going back to and Mary, those are great points, important points. One of the things that Katie referenced is something that we've been talking a lot about here at the coalition around just the kind of the idea of what inclusive growth is, and it not simply being a workforce development discussion, but we continue to operate within these silos, that all the different points that are important to one's functioning and ability to succeed in a society aren't addressed, and everything else is fractured and doesn't work. And so you talk about food security, you talk about infrastructure, you talk about proper economic development in the community and affordable housing that's associated with it. There are lots of other things that we need to be considering in this discussion, and obviously it impacts workforce, but it impacts all those other areas as well, because they are interconnected. And so, Rebecca, with a few extra seconds, I'd just love for you to talk a little bit more about, from your vantage point, just your response to that question.
Yeah, I think, Katie and Mary, I think, made some really excellent points. I think other things that we can be doing if I put my like workforce development hat on within like my system change work that we're doing is we think about really moving the needle on racial equity and thinking about social justice work. I think there are other opportunities we can think about, particularly in terms of engaging MWBE, so like minority and women-owned business enterprises in the work that we're all doing. Like full disclosure, like Carp Strategies is a WBE, DV, SBE firm. So like in our network of firms and my network of entrepreneurs, like I'm all the time partnering and talking with other MWBE business owners. And, the data bears this out. Like we tend to employ local residents. We tend to employ more women and people of color. We tend to hire other MWBEs. We tend to really keep money and resources local. And if you look across the pandemic, minority-owned firms in particular have been hardest hit financially in the recession, just as COVID has disproportionately impacted, brown and Black people. And so as we think about coming out of the recession, I think there's a really interesting and important opportunity here for employers and for government and for workforce development providers who may have contracts that you're letting out to really think about, can you look for and hire an MWBE firm to do that work? If you're looking at re-upping your IT contract, there are many fantastic MWBE IT providers out there. What does that look like? There's so many ways you can think about investing and using the funds that you have, limited as they may be at your organization, to really make an impact in the field and to have like a racial equity and racial justice perspective in the work that you do. And so I know we've been talking about individuals and both within your organization and skills training, but I also think there's something to be said for how we spend our money as organizations, regardless of what sector you're in, and knowing that MWBEs also employ a ton of people, and that's another angle of the conversation that I think we could be thinking about going forward.
I couldn't agree more. So one last question before we move into Q&A from with our guest today. If there's just in maybe 60 seconds or less, I know that's always difficult, but we'll try our best. How can we be generating, everyone on this call, if there's a single thing to say to folks in terms of the work that they can do from an advocacy perspective, what should we be doing to generate increased interest for workforce development with nationally elected leaders? And I'll start with Katie.
Thanks. So one of the things, Rebecca, I thought you were about to say, one of my favorite sayings earlier in one of your comments, is that we say a lot about advocacy is that data makes you credible and stories make you memorable. And so to the extent that everyone listening today can reach out to your members of Congress and National Skills Coalition and NYCETC and NYCETC all have infrastructure and connections to be able to help support that advocacy and tell your story. It doesn't have to be the perfect talking point. It just has to be about the experience that your organization and business and company have experienced and the workers that you've been working with and the huge role that federal policy and investment has to play in ensuring that we can reach towards an inclusive economic recovery that has benefits for workers, has benefits for sustained growth for business, and actually means that successful inclusive communities can be improved coming out of our current crisis.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie. Mary?
Yeah, building on what Katie said, I keep doing that. Again, data. One of the challenges we've had with this, particularly with this crisis, is we haven't had good data as to showing the need. In the last recession, we had that. We had pictures of people around the blocks. Well, with social distancing and the complications of the health crisis, we have had a really hard time putting our arms around what the numbers look like. Anything like that, again, it's challenging, but when your members of Congress are at home in particular, if you can get them to interact, again, it's so much more challenging right now. So, but I think, again, outreach is key, and making it personal, making it about their district or their state. Those are primarily my.
Thanks, Mary. Rebecca?
My thoughts would be around like authentic storytelling and building again on what Katie and Mary are saying, I think it's about like being very authentic to the reality of your organization and what you do in your community and the truth that you are experiencing on the ground with your organization, the need that you are perceiving and that exists, and then the opportunity that you think is there. So both sides of that coin. So this is how great you think the need is, and this is how tremendous you think the opportunity is if your elected official or representative shows up for you. I think, and there are a bunch of questions in the chat I see that are like related to this. We could talk about this, but I also think every elected official is like, you know, literally losing hair and going gray because they see their districts being decimated by job loss. And so I think if you reach out with an authentic, real story that says, this is the challenge I face, and here's a path forward with your support we could take, I think people will be responsive to that. So whether it's something in renewable energy or offshore wind, or a big construction project that if they help greenlight will bring X number of jobs to their district. I mean, there's no silver bullet here, but every elected official is looking for one. So if you can show some type of pathway toward recovery and like building our way back from the recession, like every representative is looking for it.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you, all three of you. This has really been great. We're going to open it up for Q&A now. I think we have tons of questions, as you can see in the chat. Let's try to limit actually the responses for the questions to one individual on the panel for the time being, and then we'll move on to next questions just so we can get as many of them in as possible. Our first is from Michael DeVito. Michael is the Associate Executive Director at the New York Center for Interpersonal Development. It may take a second or two for Michael to be brought up, so bear with us. And let me see, there he is.
I love this like dynamic interaction. It feels like when you pass the mic, you know, in a real room.
There you go. Michael, you're up.
I think, there you go.
And also, I had no idea that was about to happen. I thought you guys Oh, wow, that's fantastic. So thank you so much to each and every one of you. My question may be really large, and I think I didn't mean to, you know, be in any sort of state of waxing philosophical, and I've really just been thinking a lot about how, you know, we were all sent to our rooms during the pandemic to think about what we've done and how can we do something new, and just thinking about how is it that we can use the response to the pandemic, which has to be immediate and flexible. How do we use that to get a real federal commitment in training and education so that we can actually step into the 21st century with a visionary workforce that is really flexible under the plate tectonics of the new global job market? And I know that that's like a huge question.
There's who wants to jump in?
I mean, I'll jump in just really quickly. You know, that's something we've really focused on. And we're seeing so many of the changes that we were expecting to come in future of work that are already happening now because of COVID. I think we have to change the way we provide career navigation services, the way we provide training. It has to be much more accelerated. Reemployment service has to have to be part of that. And we have to try to find ways to help people make those transitions more quickly. So I do think that it is enabling us to talk about the kinds of changes that we need to see happening in our systems. Again, funding is just not following, and it's really frustrating. But I think it sets us up well for WIOA reauthorization, higher ed discussions, and higher ed reauthorization, and hopefully for recovery funding at some point.
Thanks, Mary. We're going to move on to our next question, which is from Mike Conway. Mike is the Executive Director of Stacks and Jewels. Mike, you're up.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, thanks. Equal thanks to you all, and kind of fun to pop in there. So yeah, my question is, it's related to, you know, that workforce development is often chasing opportunities in the market, and especially like related to the last question, that as we think of the rapid changes, and also that the trainees that we're working with even right now, within a year, some of those roles could be changing. And this is especially true in the automation related industries, where some of these industries are even constrained by workforce deficits. And so my question is, like, how might workforce development get out in front to help develop and advance new opportunities, new markets?
Becca?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that. I really appreciate that question, Mike. This is something I think about a lot, especially because I'm often in a position where I have developers and companies coming to me to say, hey, we're going to be doing this huge thing and we think it's going to require thousands of people and we don't know where we're going to get them from. And we're trying to figure out the skills that are needed, and it's like a crisis moment. And like an example of where I'm seeing this right now is offshore wind and renewable energy, where we're seeing at the state level up and down the East Coast, like literally competitions, almost governor to governor, of like who's going to meet their clean energy goal fast enough. And then we just saw the Biden administration release like a historic announcement about clean energy. And so it's fascinating because it's like this new industry in the US around like offshore wind and that kind of technology. And it's jobs all across the spectrum, from, you know, like technicians and folks who are actually going to be like out on boats, you know, setting up the turbines, you know, and so we have folks from kind of entry level all the way up to engineers. And it's employment at every level. And the developers of these projects are like really kind of coming to us saying, hey, we need thousands of people. There's predicted to be over 80,000 jobs in the next few years. So in that case, what we're encouraging is like, you need to be engaging with chambers of commerce, community colleges, high schools, workforce development organizations now, like yesterday, to be talking about what kind of skills are needed, transferable skills. And like we've been helping them identify what are analogous occupations and jobs that could be transferred over. And so it gets to kind of my earlier point of, you need workforce development professionals in the conversation early and often and always. And I think when we have like economists that are working at the state and national level, looking at what industries are nascent and growing, I think like that's the point to have workforce development organizations involved. I feel like it should almost be like a requirement for every big project. I don't think we're there yet, but we're doing the best that we can.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Mike. Our next question is from Kenneth Edwards, who is a participant leadership and organizing specialist at the Center for Employment Opportunities, or CEO. Kenneth, you're up.
Sorry. So my question is, I know we spoke about a lot of marginalized individuals, but I didn't hear any conversation about the workforce development regarding individuals that are formerly incarcerated justly. Are any of your organizations or organizations that you're affiliated with working towards assisting those individuals that are returning home to get back into the workforce?
Anyone want to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in on this unless Katie or Mary, please go for it.
I mean, Katie, you haven't answered one. Do you have anything on that? Or, I mean, we do too, but I mean, go ahead.
I mean, Kenneth, I think that what you're describing is the foundation of the partnerships that Rebecca was just talking about, right? It's not, this is, and I think this is kind of the answer to all three questions. There's really big blue sky things that we can do to address workforce challenges. We need to invest hundreds of billions of more dollars. We need to make it possible for every worker to be able to access skills and supports in order to be successful. We need to make sure that businesses across the spectrum of size and industry have access to and understand the role of our post-secondary and our workforce system. And then there's really basic things that we need to do today in order to set the stage for some of those blue sky things. The first of which is partnerships. Rebecca, you say that we should have requirements. In every piece of legislation that National Skills Coalition pushes that has a federal funding lens, we require one of the quality control mechanisms is that funding goes to a partnership between a demand side entity, whether it's an employer or a demand side agency who's actually going to be hiring people from those programs, and to education providers. And Kenneth, to your question specifically, one of the things in the work that National Skills Coalition has been doing really intentionally over the past couple of years is building out deeper recommendations for our policy work through work with organizations like CEO and your colleagues across the country and other organizations that are serving both justice-involved youth and adults and people of color to be able to vet and develop policy solutions that meaningfully bring those organizations into those partnerships from the beginning. The same way that Rebecca was talking about workforce needing to be at the seat, and part of that partnership from the beginning, organizations that serve both justice involved and people of color need to be part of those conversations too, in order to embed that racial equity and greater access from the beginning. So it's not that exciting, and it seems easy to the people in the call that have been doing this, but to a member of Congress, the idea of using public funds and not that much public funding to support that infrastructure of a partnership takes a lot of advocacy. And so then again, circling back to my other key theme is the way that we do this in answer to all three questions is by you all having the time and capacity to engage and bring that message to your members of Congress.
Yeah, and if I know we're at time, but I wanted to throw in one thing. Something positive did just happen in the last COVID package that was passed before the end of the Congress. Pell Grants can now be used for currently incarcerated people who are in eligible training programs, and that's something new and exciting. You know, one of the things that we're seeing in this COVID crisis is people really want short-term credentials. They really want to focus on getting back to work as quickly as possible. And so one of the things that NSC and our organization have been really pushing for is to make Pell Grants available for short-term programs that are of high quality. And so figuring out a way to determine quality of programs is going to be key. It will provide, if we get that, more access, and including for people who are, you know, in the process of re-entering from corrections. So
thanks, Mary. And we do, I saw you, Rebecca, but we do have two other questions and want to
Go for it.
So appreciate that. Hey, our next question, and second to last question, in fact, is from Libby. Libby is a program manager over at Brooklyn Workforce Innovations, or BWI. Libby, you're up.
Thanks a lot. My question is to the point, who are the most effective advocates to participate in advocacy? I got to do some advocacy work for renewable energy back at the beginning of the Obama administration on behalf of a large private sector employer. So I'm just curious if there's anyone else this group should try to bring into the conversation in addition to ourselves.
I mean, I would always say, if you can get the private sector with you when you're pursuing your advocacy efforts, I think cross-sector advocacy efforts are always really powerful. So I think, like, if you're, you know, at Brooklyn Works and you have like a big employer in Brooklyn with you, or small employers doing, I think that that's really powerful. Like, I always think that there's like something really magical that can happen when a cross-sector coalition, you know, is leading an initiative together. And Katie, curious as to what, and I saw you come off of mute, what your perspective is kind of on the federal level for that.
I think that's exactly right. And the one thing I'll say is, right now in the virtual environment, any sort of outreach is great. Like, I think the most important thing is being in touch with your member of Congress. The ideal would be exactly what Rebecca said. If you can bring in a slice of what that partnership looks like that you're asking for federal funding for, then that paints the picture that it's easier for the staffer and the member of Congress to remember.
Thank you both. Our last question is from Yazeli. Did I pronounce that correctly? Just want to make sure. You're on mute.
Sorry, happens all the time. Hi, I'm Jessie Ellie. That's just spelled it correctly. I'm from La Guardia Community College in CUNY. So you answered a lot of the questions I had. I'll ask again just in case there's anything to add. So I mentioned how job positions are growing in the tech field, such as software engineer, data analytics, and so more. How do you see policies and funding in the future changing so that it ensures that there are skills training available for Black, Latinx women and other minority populations, and how it might address the digital divide that these populations may be encountering? And how can you promote, and I think that was answering the last question, how can we promote or join advocacy efforts for these policies? And the last question that I think is related is, do you have any thoughts on how public education and community colleges may have a role in policy, or receiving funding to target these populations that are in need for workforce development.
So maybe we stick with the last question there, because that's an area that we probably haven't covered as much today. Does anyone want to jump in and answer that question related to public higher education?
Mary, I'm sure you want to.
No, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mary.
I think all of us, maybe we can all do a quick last thing. You know, public institutions, absolutely, public systems, community college systems are going to be key. The Biden administration has made it very clear in the campaign proposals they put forward, community colleges are going to be out in front on providing training. And that's wonderful. And we do want to see those investments. You know, the administration has talked about free college for individuals, including adults, and they've also talked about $50 billion investments. Probably won't see that high of investments, but in community colleges to establish partnerships with high demand industry sectors, which of course would include technology. If we see anything near that, I think that'll be fantastic, but we have to change the way we provide education and training in this country. We have to start looking at pathways, career pathways approaches if we're going to serve people who have been left behind before. We have to, again, figure out acceleration strategies, stackable credentials, a lot of things that will well serve these populations, but we have to do it well. And I know other people want to say something, so I could talk for a whole day on this. But anyway, Katie, you were trying to talk, and I think you were too.
I would say in like 2 sentences that, I mean, LaGuardia Community College, I think, you know, among the community college like system in the country, I think is known as being like a shining star, right? I think you have outsized power in the advocacy world in terms of if LaGuardia opens its mouth, I think everyone will listen. So I think in terms of LaGuardia's advocacy position, especially around tech and tech job training, I think you're really well positioned to be speaking for it. I know I was working with a group of developers who were looking at a big project in Long Island City on the site that Amazon had walked away from for their HQ2. And those developers were regularly meeting with LaGuardia Community College to think about what jobs would be created and therefore what would the ask be of LaGuardia Community College, knowing that everybody goes to LaGuardia, everybody goes to community colleges to say, how can you be involved and what would we need in terms of training the next generation? So I think you're well positioned. And again, going back to that cross-sector strategy for cross-sector coalitions for advocacy, I think is the way to go.
Katie, anything you want to add in 30 seconds before we wrap up?
I would just echo all of that, and another plug for the fact that that telling your story and reaching out to your members of Congress, again, through the capacity that the organizations, both NYCETC, NYCETC, and NSC have, National Skills Coalition have, in order to empower you to do that. We have talking points, we have contact information, we have all of those asks in order to make it as easy as possible so that we can leverage up all the questions that we got to today and those that we haven't.
Thank you so much. That concludes our discussion for today. Katie, Mary, Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing your diverse expertise and perspectives with our members and partners. This was fantastic. And we can never get enough. It always goes over because our groups are so just excited about having incredible leaders spend time with us. So really appreciate your time. Thank you.